Lorrie Goldstein, the associate editor of the Toronto Sun, has written an article in the November 13th edition of the paper showing an interesting change in the orientation towards the Occupy protests. Sun Media, who is owned by the larger media empire Quebecor Media, has always had a staunchly anti-Occupy position. It's had its columnists write all sorts of petty name-calling, referring to people such as homeless drug addicts who refuse to get jobs, to just making grotesque, clearly fraudulent observations like semen-stained ground. It appears now the associate editor is trying a different tactic, going from insulting and berating people to trying to shift the blame onto them. Let's take a look at what Goldstein is saying in his article. I agree with them. Financial fraud on Wall Street and political corruption in Washington are largely responsible for the global economic mess we're in today. Stock markets were manipulated and banks and investment houses bailed out with U.S. taxpayers' money. Regulations governing stock markets were gutted by Wall Street, which bribed politicians into stacking the rules in their favor. Public anger at corrupt Wall Street executives and their bought and paid for politicians, Republican and Democrats, justified. So far, so good. He's admitted that the financial elite are directly responsible for the mess that we are globally in. He acknowledges that the system was manipulated by the most powerful people taking part in it and used it to their advantage at the expense of the vast majority. Hell, he even comes close to hinting that the electoral system is a complete fraud. But then he turns around with all this truth, and maybe even honesty, and hits us with this. But I disagree with the occupiers' view that capitalism itself is the problem and wealth redistribution by the state is the answer, a phenomenon known as crony capitalism. Now we get to the heart of what this article is really all about. His argument here is simple and, quite frankly, predictable. That's not real capitalism. It's now a very tiring market fundamentalist excuse for the excesses, the manipulations, and greed. Simply deny the very nature of a greed-driven system and try to point to a completely abstract conception of it as the way it's really supposed to be. Goldstein is about one Mises blog post away from claiming that corporations aren't real capitalism, though I suppose it would be a very difficult argument to make, being so deeply entrenched in and benefiting from one. Basically, his entire statement here, as well as the rest of that part of the article, is just simply denying that a greed-based system was responsible for people acting in a greedy manner. Denial. At this point, he begins his offensive against any alternative to capitalism. Whenever this has been tried, the state becomes the ultimate crony capitalist, and it does to the public exactly what Wall Street and Congress did to them starting in 2008, only on steroids. This is just an outright lie. Socialist countries don't have stock trading, collateralized debt obligations, or even mortgages for that matter. These countries didn't have publicly traded companies. That is the whole point of communism. That is what the pro-capitalist camp always screams as an attack on their freedom. How could things that don't exist be made to function like they're on steroids? What happened, and Mr. Goldstein agrees with me, is that the financial sector was deregulated. In socialist countries, there was none of this. The financial sector was based on state-managed plans, not investments, which are essentially gambling. This statement is playing on the fact that it is published in the Sun, the vast majority of its viewership knowing nothing of what socialism even is. But I disagree with the protesters who say that they are against the bailout of Wall Street, but in favor of bailing out giant auto companies, which they've indicated by accepting the support of the Canadian auto workers. That tells me these protesters really aren't against government picking economic winners or losers. They just want to pick the winners and losers of which they approve. It doesn't take much to understand why the public was willing to help out the auto manufacturing industry rather than the financial industry. The public wanted to help the working and middle class, the people who lost what they had as a result of the actions of the people in the financial industry. The people wanted bailing out to help the people, not the elites who caused the problem. Basically, he's complaining that the public didn't want to help the rich, the people he works for, and instead want help themselves, the actual victims. He is basically calling the public hypocrites for wanting to help themselves, the victims, and not the perpetrators, the financial aristocracy. This is just stupid. From insulting the public, he moves on to what was the real point of this entire article, to defend the private sector and attack the public sector. I also disagree with the occupiers' failure to condemn the roles played by government entitlement programs and public sector greed in the ongoing global economic crisis. There is a very good reason why the occupiers don't blame public wage-earning workers for the global collapse of capitalism. Public sector employees did not cause the global capitalist crisis. The financial elite did. Those on the very top with the actual control of the economy caused the mess we're in. He goes on to give an example citing Greek's economic woes from what he correctly calls a giant Ponzi scheme. What he's deliberately leaving out is the fact that the investment scheme was put together and run by Goldman Sachs. He is deliberately leaving out the fact that a giant financial institution is responsible for that particular problem. Also, given the fact that he is the associate editor of the Toronto Sun, it's also quite transparent where he's going with this whipping up of anti-public sector sentiment. He's no doubt drumming up anger against the CBC, which Quebecor, who owns the Sun, is at war with to have privatized. Given that the Sun is only read in Toronto and nearby parts of Ontario, it's very doubtful he's trying to actually reach the people involved in the Wall Street occupation. This is intended for consumption in the Toronto and surrounding areas to generate hostility towards the CBC. As if to punctuate this point, he gives us this. Finally, bribery and corruption are widespread in the public sector. Unfortunately, he didn't have the space in the column to cite any example of this. Nor does he ever acknowledge that the bribery and corruption that are something that can happen in the public sector are common practice in the private sector, especially in the banking and finance sector, which he acknowledges cause the economic mess that the world is in. Finally, he concludes with this statement. But to ignore those same things in the public sector and their contribution to the economic tsunami we're now experiencing is absurd and blatantly inconsistent. No, sir. Your article trying to pass blame to the public sector for the outright crimes committed by the private sector is absurd.